Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. At 17 years old, most teenagers are thinking about school, friends, and what their future might look like. Few understand the weight of permanent decisions. Fewer still understand what the word life truly means when spoken inside a courtroom. But for some teenagers in the United States, that word was spoken clearly, firmly, and without mercy. This chapter begins in an American courtroom, where a teenager stands before a judge, not as a child, but as an adult in the eyes of the law. The room is quiet. Lawyers speak in formal language. Legal terms fill the air. And somewhere in the middle of it all is a 17-year-old who does not yet understand that this moment will define the rest of his existence. For decades, U.S. law allowed teenagers to be tried as adults for serious crimes. In many states, prosecutors had the power to move juvenile cases into adult court, exposing minors to the same punishments as grown men and women. Once that decision was made, age stopped mattering. Childhood stopped mattering. What mattered was the crime and the sentence that followed. When the judge pronounced life in prison without parole, it sounded procedural, calm, controlled. But behind those words was a reality the teenager could not fully grasp. Life without parole does not mean decades. It does not mean growing old behind bars and one day walking free. It means dying in prison. It means no second chance. No future outside concrete walls. At 17, the brain is still developing. Neuroscience now confirms what many psychologists long argued. Teenagers lack full impulse control, long-term reasoning, and the ability to fully understand permanent consequences. Yet, in that courtroom, none of that mattered. The sentence was final. The door closed. Within days or weeks, the teenager was transferred into an adult prison system. The environment was immediate and unforgiving. Surrounded by men twice his age, he learned quickly that survival required silence, caution, and constant awareness. There were no special protections. No gradual transition. Childhood ended the moment the prison gates closed behind him. What made these cases especially devastating was not just the punishment, but the misunderstanding. Many juveniles sentenced to life later admitted they had no idea what the sentence meant. Some believed parole would eventually come. Others thought good behavior might lead to release. But as years passed, the truth settled in. There was no exit. This was not an isolated story. Across the United States, thousands of teenagers entered prison under similar circumstances. Some at 16, some at 17, sentenced to die behind bars. Their names rarely made headlines. Their stories unfolded quietly, measured in years spent inside cells, watching the world move on without them. It is about a teenager who entered prison still growing, still learning, still becoming someone. And yet, from that day forward, the system decided he would never become anything else. He entered prison at 17, and before he fully understood what life meant, it was already taken away. The first years inside prison did not feel like life. They felt unreal. At 17, the teenager arrived carrying nothing but paperwork, fear, and confusion. The adult prison system did not slow down for his age. Intake was fast, mechanical, and impersonal. A number replaced his name. A uniform replaced his clothes. And the message was clear from the beginning. This place was not built for children. Adult prison is ruled by routine and hierarchy. Every movement is watched. Every sound carries meaning. For a teenager still learning who he was, the environment was overwhelming. Conversations were guarded. Trust was dangerous. Silence was often the safest choice. He learned quickly to keep his head down, his eyes forward, and his emotions hidden. Days followed a strict pattern. Count. Meals. Lockdown. Count again. Recreation, when allowed, happened under watchful eyes. Time moved slowly at first, each day heavy and unfamiliar. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. The teenager grew older, but the world he entered remained unchanged. What changed was his understanding. At some point, different for everyone, the truth finally settled in. There would be no parole hearing, no review board, no future date circled on a calendar. Good behavior would not lead to release. Education would not shorten the sentence. The system was not waiting to see who he might become. It had already decided. That realization carried a weight far heavier than the bars themselves. Psychologists have described this moment as one of the most damaging for juvenile lifers. Hope collapses. Motivation weakens. The future disappears. For someone who entered prison before adulthood, the realization often comes after they have matured enough to understand it, making the sentence feel even crueler in hindsight. The teenager watched other inmates come and go. He watched men count down years, pack belongings, and leave. Each release was a reminder that he was not on the same path. His time was not moving toward freedom. It was moving toward an ending that would happen inside those walls. Yet life did not stop completely. He learned. He adapted. Some juvenile lifers turned to education, religion, or structured routines as a way to survive mentally. Others withdrew. Some struggled with anger. Others with depression. Everyone coped differently. But the sentence was always there, silent, permanent, unavoidable. As the years passed, the teenager became an adult in prison. He learned responsibility too late for it to matter. He gained self-awareness after punishment had already been sealed. He changed, but the system did not. This is the paradox of juvenile life sentences. Growth comes after it is no longer useful. The justice system punishes a child for who they were at their worst moment, then ignores who they become afterward. It is about time. About growing up in a place where growth does not lead anywhere. About learning life's lessons after the opportunity to use them is gone. He entered prison at 17. And inside those walls, he grew into someone the system would never allow to leave. Years later, the teenager who entered prison at 17 no longer looked like a child. His voice had deepened. His face had aged. His body carried the quiet signs of time spent behind bars. But despite everything that had changed, one thing remained exactly the same: his sentence. Outside the prison walls, the country was changing. Lawmakers, scientists, and judges began to look more closely at juvenile sentencing. Advances in neuroscience confirmed what many had suspected for years, that the teenage brain is still developing, especially in areas responsible for judgment, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences. In simple terms, teenagers are not finished becoming who they will be. These findings reached the courts. One by one, cases involving juveniles sentenced to life without parole were challenged. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. The court acknowledged a truth the justice system had long ignored. Children are different from adults, and punishment must reflect that difference. For many incarcerated as teenagers, these rulings reopened doors that had been shut for decades. Some were granted resentencing hearings. Others became eligible for parole review for the first time in their lives. Judges were now required to consider who the person had become, not just who they were at 17. But change came unevenly. Not every juvenile lifer benefited. Some sentences were upheld. Some cases were delayed for years. Others were denied altogether due to technicalities, state laws, or the nature of the crime. For many, hope arrived late and fragile. The possibility of freedom existed, but it was no longer guaranteed. Inside prison, the man who had entered as a teenager faced a new kind of struggle. After decades of routine, isolation, and institutional life, the idea of freedom felt unfamiliar. Even imagining life outside the walls was difficult. The world had moved forward without him. Technology had changed. Society had changed. Everyone he once knew had grown older, or disappeared from his life entirely. And yet, the question remained. Should a decision made at 17 define an entire lifetime? Supporters of reform argued that people should not be permanently judged by their worst moment as children. They pointed to rehabilitation, personal growth, and the capacity for change. Opponents argued that some crimes are so severe that punishment must remain permanent, regardless of age. There were no easy answers. Victims' families carried lifelong grief. Communities wrestled with fear and forgiveness. Courts balanced justice with mercy. The debate cut deep, touching the core of what punishment is meant to accomplish. For the man who entered prison at 17, the outcome was uncertain. Whether he would die behind bars or one day walk free depended on laws, judges, and decisions far beyond his control. What was certain, however, was that he had spent his entire adult life inside prison, growing, learning, and changing in a place that never expected him to. Between who someone was at 17 and who they became decades later. It is about a justice system slowly recognizing its own limits, even as it struggles to correct them. He entered prison at 17. He'll die. There is not just a story about incarceration. It is a story about time, growth, and the irreversible weight of decisions made too early. It asks a question America is still trying to answer. How much should a child's future be allowed to change? And how much should it be taken away forever?